Welcome everyone, I'm Brian Walsh, and in today's lesson we are going over how to calculate the mass percent.
You'll see the formula for mass percent written several different ways, but for me this is the easiest way to see. So mass percent is the mass of part of a substance divided by the mass of the whole substance times 100. Let's start by looking at a non-chemistry example to get a better idea of what this means. Let's say that we have an empty cup that has a mass of 300 grams. And we also have 700 grams of water. So when we put the water into the cup, now we have a total that has a mass of 1,000 grams. Right, because we've added our 700 grams of water to our 300 grams of cup. So what if we're asked to find the mass percent of H2O in our total? We can see that water only makes up a part of the total, right? Which tells us that our 700 grams of water is going to be the mass of the part in our equation. And we already know that our total mass is 1,000 grams, so that 1,000 grams is going to be the mass of the whole. So we have our 700 grams of water divided by our 1,000 grams of total times 100, and what we get is 70%, which tells us that water makes up 70% of the total mass of the cup and water. Let's go ahead and look at a real sample problem now. So this problem says, what is the mass percent of carbon in carbon dioxide? So the question asks us to find the mass percent of carbon in carbon dioxide. And that tells us that carbon is going to be our part. It also tells us that carbon dioxide is going to be our whole. Which means that we can rewrite our equation to look like this. So what we're looking for is the mass percent of carbon. We know that carbon is the part, so we're looking for the mass of carbon over the molar mass of CO2 times 100. Looking at the question, they didn't give us a mass of carbon and they didn't give us a mass of carbon dioxide. And they're not usually going to do that. So what that means is when you're finding the mass of the whole, you're going to use the molar mass of whatever the whole is, in this case carbon dioxide. We're going to use the molar mass as the whole. I also color-coded the carbon to try to illustrate that we're trying to find the mass of carbon in this whole compound. In other words, what part of the mass of this CO2 is made up of just the C? So the first thing we want to do to solve this problem is we're going to calculate the molar mass of CO2. So 1 mole of CO2 has 1 mole of carbon and 2 moles of oxygen. So we have 1 mole of carbon and 2 moles of oxygen, and I wrote these over 1 just to make it easier to see how our units cancel. So we'll start by calculating the mass of carbon. And if we look at our periodic table, we'll see that the molar mass of carbon is 12.011 grams per mole. So I went ahead and rounded the molar mass to 4 significant figures, and we set this up so our moles are on bottom. So these moles on bottom will cancel with these moles on top, and because we're looking for grams, we now have grams on top. So we can do our calculation here. Our moles on top, our moles on bottom cancel, and now we're left with grams. So we multiply 1 times 12.01, and we get 12.01 grams of carbon. We look at our periodic table and we see that the molar mass of oxygen is 15.999 grams per mole. So again, I rounded it to 4 significant figures, set it up so moles on bottom and moles on top cancel. So these moles cancel with these moles, and now we're left with grams. We multiply 2 times 16 divided by 1, and we get 32 grams of oxygen. Now we can add these together, and what we get is 44.01 grams of CO2, and that's going to be our molar mass of CO2. Remember that our equation for finding the mass percent of carbon is mass of carbon divided by the molar mass of CO2 times 100. Well, in step 1, we found the molar mass of CO2, so we can update our equation now. So now what we have is mass percent of carbon equals mass of carbon over 44.01 grams times 100. Which means that our next step is going to be to find the mass of carbon. So step 2 says calculate the mass of carbon in 1 mole of CO2. But if we think about it, we actually already did this in the last step. When we were calculating the molar mass of CO2, we found the mass of carbon to be 12.01 grams. Which means that our mass of carbon in our equation up here is going to be 12.01 grams. So now we know the mass of carbon and we know the molar mass of CO2. So if we look back at our equation, we see that we have this and we have this. So we have everything we need to solve right now. So we're just going to plug in our values and solve for the mass percent. So we take 12.01 grams of carbon divided by 44.01 grams total times 100. And what we find is that the mass percent of carbon in CO2 is 27.29%.
If you have any questions about anything, or if you have any feedback that you'd like to give me, please leave me a message. You can leave a comment, or you can email me at chemistrymadeeasy118@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.